You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. We had a busy week last week. Had 2 guests. Had a fun time talking football, transfer portal stuff, all the usual, the good stuff. And we're going to continue today talking football and some other stuff. So just to kind of preview a little bit about what this episode's going to be about, I know sometimes that helps people. We'll talk a little bit about the NFL draft, kind of what happened there and kind of what's going on for some Utah players. The transfer portal closed, and so we'll kind of give some updates there and a little look there. And then today, Mason Madsen, former Utah basketball player, released his latest video blog that has some interesting takes on kind of the end of the season. So I'll play some of that, and we'll get into that. But really interested in that. So we'll get into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners. Every possibility begins with a spark, and a possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, UFirst Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump right into this. So, relatively quiet weekend for the University of Utah in terms of the NFL draft. Obviously, early on, there was some early buzz about guys maybe like Junior Tafuna or Karene Reed. They obviously got some NFL Combine invites. Tafuna on the first day performed, well and was doing some good stuff. Obviously, had a good Senior Bowl showing, and so there was a lot of optimism about what he could do, and maybe potentially getting a spot in the NFL draft. So you had some of that, but as kind of the days went on and as the draft came closer, it kind of started to seem like Utah players were going to be a little bit more on the outside looking in, probably day 3 guys at best. Maybe a guy could sneak into day 2, but that wasn't very likely. It was more day 3 guys, the rounds 4 through 7. Guys that are probably projected to be much more on the bubble of making a team, even if they do get drafted. And so it was, kind of turning that way and a little quiet. So not a lot going on. Obviously, Shedeur Sanders kind of hijacked the draft simply based on him being projected to be a first round pick and not going till the 5th round. So things got a little crazy. Obviously, there's the prank calls. There's a lot of different things that kind of overshadowed a lot of what took place in the draft. You had Mel Kiper going on a rant about Shedeur, really kind of, unusual, we'll call it, maybe unprofessional to some extent. Depends on your take on it, but really interesting draft with those kind of elements. Outside of that, it was a pretty quiet draft, not a lot of drama beyond that. And locally, there's a few players that were selected. Jalen Royals from Utah State went to the Chiefs for as a wide receiver. But outside of that, there wasn't much for Utah until the 7th round, when out of the blue, tight end Caleb Lohner, 1 year of college football, ends up getting drafted with the number 25 pick in the 7th round, which is the number 241. They were almost done. And the Denver Broncos decided to use their very last pick on him. And he had met with the Broncos previously. This wasn't a surprise in the sense that a team was just taking a flyer on him. But it was a surprise because at the end of the day, he had 54 yards and 4 touchdowns to his name. Sure, those 4 touchdowns came on 4 catches, so there clearly showed some potential, but there just honestly wasn't a lot of tape, right? He had something like 57 total snaps at Utah. We don't have to recap how bad that offense was last year to kind of showcase what happened. But the fact that he was able to be drafted with that kind of production shows more about kind of who he is as an individual and kind of the production that he could be, the projection, I should say. He was quoted as saying from the Broncos, "I know I don't have a ton of football under my belt, but that's exactly why I'm playing the game, because I've developed a passion and love. I was so excited. I think it's something you dream about in sports, so here we are now." He said it was one of the best decisions he's ever made to be able to go to the University of Utah and play football. He said, "I couldn't be more grateful for all the schools that I was at, but especially at the University of Utah, their football program, the Whittinghams, Coach Kyle and Coach Freddie Whittingham." So obviously very complimentary of his time at Utah. They were the ones kind of getting in his ear about playing football. Obviously he'd been a basketball player, but they had kind of gotten in his ear saying, "Hey, we think you could do it as a tight end." And, this is well documented. We talked about kind of his glow up, so to speak, in terms of what he was able to do. It was an intriguing prospect back in the fall, just trying to see kind of, can a guy who has been playing basketball essentially his whole life make that transition? Obviously he had the frame, he had the body for it, but could that translate, right? And early on, obviously there was a lot of success there, but Kyle really wanted to see how his he worked with pads on, kind of the next level kind of evolution of that, and he continued to flourish with it, right? To the point where he became kind of the target in a lot of ways in those situations. And so became a favorite target for Isaac Wilson. In fact, it was his first touchdown for both of them as a college football player to be able to have that opportunity. So, really fascinating kind of projection and look at who he was based on just a little bit of stuff. But I'm really curious what would have happened if Utah had a more potent offense, right? Would things have been different? Would it have provided too much tape? Would it have, gone the other way and it actually hurt him? I don't know. I think there's a lot of different things that benefited him in terms of what he was able to do. But the reality is it's all a projection at this point, right? And sometimes that's those 7th round picks. You're projecting on these guys and trying to figure it out. But I wanted to play some audio of head coach Sean Payton talking to the Denver media about kind of why they picked him. Obviously it's their last pick. As I said, this is kind of the area where you can make some of those flyers or take some of those flyers and really kind of do something that you probably wouldn't do in the first 3 rounds or maybe even a little bit higher in the day 3 rounds. But for the 7th round pick, this became an opportunity where it was, the upside maybe outweighs stuff. So let's play the audio. This is the reporter asking the question and his answer.
Over to your left, Zach Stevens, DNVR. The final pick was Caleb Lohner. Sean, you've had some experience in the past of drafting a guy with only 1 year of football experience. How difficult for both of you is it to draft a guy and evaluate a guy when it's just on 1 year and a guy that only had 4 catches
57
this year?
plays.
And what do you see? What did you see from him?
It's hard. Look, I think going back with Jimmy Graham, I think he had 14, 15 catches. Both of them had a season. Both of them were very good basketball players. And now in Jimmy's case, there was a lot more. He was a combine invite. And, with Caleb, like we were talking about earlier, we're late in this draft. And you're rooting for some guys, and you see upside. He's 6'7", 245. You can see the basketball skill set. That's easy at a high level. And then, you're looking at a small amount of playing time, and yet enough to where you're watching him. I think the other thing that helped was watching him at the Big 12 Pro Day. There's just a few plays that you see movement skills. And, man, there's a lot to work with. And, if it turns out like the last one did, then we'd be real excited. And you go all the way back, really, in our league historically. Gates was signed, I believe, undrafted. And so it's kind of one of those things where the body types for tight end, it's not like they're making less of them. They may be playing volleyball. They may be playing basketball, but it's projecting. And then when you get a chance to see him play football, he goes through a season of putting pads on. but his movement skills and his height, weight, and his eye-hand coordination, there's a lot of developmental upside, and we're excited about that.
As you said, obviously there's a lot of upside, and a lot of the measurables make it easy. He's not necessarily worried about him coming from basketball, right? He said guys play volleyball, guys plays basketball. Tight ends can kind of make that transition maybe better than some other players. Obviously, there's a lot of skill that goes into it, right? So we don't want to eliminate the tight end or devalue kind of what they do. But based on their size and kind of just being athletic guys, there's been opportunities to be able to make that transition. As he mentioned, Jimmy Graham, one of the guys that he coached and drafted, was a guy that played basketball all through his collegiate career at the University of Miami. Decided his graduate season he wanted to play football, so he decided to play one fall season with Miami there, and ended up getting drafted in the third round. This is a guy that obviously had a lot more tape. He had a lot more opportunities for him in terms of what he was able to do at Miami. But then translates, I guess, to that a 13-year NFL career, almost gets to 9,000 receiving yards, has 89 touchdowns, 5-time Pro Bowler. In 2013, he led the league in receiving touchdowns, receivers and tight ends. Just a simply amazing player who was able to take being a basketball player and one season of college football and translating that into a remarkable college football season or an NFL career, right? He also mentioned Gates. This is Antonio Gates, by the way, in case you don't know who that reference was. Antonio Gates was a little different, and this is not somebody that Sean Payton coached. And so that was why there's not as much reference to that, but more looking at kind of some of these guys that have made this, right? Like Caleb Lohner is not the first guy to go from basketball, obviously, as I mentioned with Jimmy Graham. But Antonio Gates is probably maybe a little bit more similar to Caleb Lohner in the sense that Gates actually didn't even play any college football. He spent his entire career playing college basketball. I should say his collegiate career playing college basketball. And he wasn't kind of a great fit, at least according to scouts, for the NBA. And so back in 2003, this is, to me, that doesn't sound that long ago, but this is actually, 22 years ago. He decided to just go work out for some NFL teams. And the San Diego Chargers, now the Los Angeles Chargers, decided to pick him up as an undrafted free agent, and the rest is history. He's an 8-time Pro Bowler, an incredible athlete who's played a long time. It's been a crazy journey for a lot of these guys, but it goes to show that, there is some opportunities there. And two of those two guys are easy to pick on as successes, right? There's going to be a lot of guys that have tried to make that jump that haven't. I don't know that there's a huge amount, and I'm not going to go do the research into that. But at the same time, there is a path there. So, you're looking at this. Can Caleb Lohner be the next Jimmy Graham? Can he be the next Antonio Gates, right? You've got a coach now that understands what that's like. He's been able to do that with Jimmy Graham. Caleb Lohner is a smart guy. He understands what it takes. He works hard. This is his opportunity to prove it, right? It's easy to say, I got drafted and fall by the wayside and nobody remembers you ever again, right? Cool, you had a great basketball career. You played 1 year of college football and, nobody's going to remember you other than you were drafted in the 7th round, right? This is now his opportunity to kind of showcase what he did a little bit in the fall with Utah, where he was able to, really showcase his talent, showcase his ability to be able to make that transition. Earlier in the year, he did declare, after the basketball season had ended, when he rejoined Utah basketball, that, he was going to pursue the NFL, right? So he's been doing everything possible to be able to make that jump. He did everything that he needed to be able to showcase his talent at the Big 12 Pro Day, which is largely why the Denver Broncos selected him. They did have that film, but it's limited film at that. And so they were able to see kind of the measurables and see him live and be able to do different things that way. That really helped him. So really fascinating to see kind of where his trajectory is. He's on a team that will absolutely maybe give him the leash, so to speak, to be able to do this. But at the end of the day, this is a business, right? And so we'll see how it works. If he can't get that into OTAs or in the fall session of what they're able to do to get it down to that 53-man roster, that's tough. And maybe he makes, the training camps and all that other stuff, and he becomes one of those players that are able to kind of be on the fringe and stay with it. It can happen, right? You don't have to make the 53-man roster to completely be with the team. But I think based on his measurables and what he's able to do on special teams, especially in what he's able to do with trying to block kicks, that kind of stuff, there's a lot to like here, right? I don't feel like we need to go too in depth on who Caleb Lohner is. You guys are all familiar with him, what his skill set is. But really, really intriguing prospect in terms of being able to get to the NFL. If you were to tell me a year ago that the only Utah player drafted in the 2025 NFL draft was a basketball player who wasn't even on Utah's team at the time, you'd be pretty crazy. So, really fascinating story. You have to hope that it works out for him. I think that would be a really cool story to be able to kind of see, what Kyle and Freddie Whittingham thought was the best decision for him, right? And it goes to show that if he, because he listened to their, their pleading, so to speak, what that could change for him, right? It could be honestly a life-changing event, because the reality is he really wasn't going to be an NBA player. Maybe he's a fringe G League guy, goes over to Europe and plays some of that kind of stuff. But for the most part, he'd kind of lived out the best days of his basketball career. And so the fact that he has this lifeline in the NFL is kind of remarkable. So really fascinated to kind of see how that goes. But it's crazy how life kind of has its turns, and we'll see if Caleb Lohner can make the most of it. So as I mentioned, Lohner was the only player drafted from Utah this year. Outside of Lohner and Jalen Royals, those are the only two players that played inside the state that were drafted this year. Nobody from BYU was selected. There were a handful of guys that were selected from Utah high schools that didn't play their collegiate career here, Jackson Dart being kind of the most notable there. Obviously, he gets a first-round pick and is going to go on and do some things with the Giants. So curious to see there. But for Utah guys, some of the guys that got undrafted free agency deals, you have Karene Reed, who is also going to the Denver Broncos. The Broncos have been, especially in this current iteration, have been really favorable toward Utah players and wanting them to come in. So Karene Reed will get that opportunity at linebacker. Obviously, he's a smaller linebacker, kind of a tweener to some extent, and really curious to see what happens there. Mekhi Bernard picks up a deal with the Tennessee Titans. Connor O'Toole picks a deal up with Seattle Seahawks. Zamiah Vaughn goes to the Minnesota Vikings. And then, it took a bit, but Junior Tafuna is going to the Houston Texans to kind of see what happens there. And then just today, we've learned that Dorian Singer, wide receiver, he's getting a mini camp invite at Las Vegas, so the Las Vegas Raiders. Honestly, that's a guy that probably the offensive season hurt him the most. He was able to do a ton with what little Utah had to give. But based on that, as well as not really getting a ton of production at USC the year before, that really kind of hurt his chances of being able to be there. It also didn't help that he was waiting for a waiver. He was hoping to come back to Utah for one last season under the NCAA's kind of potential changes and different things that way, and it just didn't go his way. So, he was really kind of hurt by the whole process. Obviously, he knew that there could be potential that way by trying to pursue a waiver with Utah, but just a tough situation for him. Obviously he showcases a lot of talent, but what that could mean at the NFL remains to be seen. But he's going to get that opportunity with Las Vegas, and for his sake, you have to hope that he can do the most with it and try to make something out of that. And then Alakai Gilman, safety. He picks up also a mini camp invite to the Los Angeles Chargers. So a lot of guys getting opportunities, but it comes more of the undrafted situation. A lot more work needing to be done to be able to make a team. That's not to say none of these guys will make a team. Obviously, we've seen some other guys be able to do that. It just means it's going to be much more challenging. At the end of the day, though, you get your foot in the door, right? And whether you're drafted in the first round or you're an undrafted free agent, it's all about getting your foot in the door and trying to be able to showcase your talent, right? At that point, it doesn't matter where you went. It doesn't matter what's going on. If anything, it allows you to be more hungry and, kind of showcase your talent. Obviously, there's a difference between first-round guys, second-round guys than those that are undrafted, but that's not to say that these guys can't have success. So, we'll do our best to kind of update on them. You'll get the OTAs here soon and some other stuff, and they won't cut down to the 53-man roster till obviously close to the season. So we'll stay close to that to see if any of these guys make a roster. Some of the notable absences though were Brant Keithy. Obviously this is a guy that for if I remember right, 3 straight years had a NFL Combine invite, Senior Bowl invite. Kept turning it down to be able to stay, and it hurt him, right? Like it's easy to see that staying at Utah hurt him, not because of who Utah is, just more the fact that he got injured twice to 2 season-ending injuries. One essentially kept him out for 2 straight years. The other one obviously derailed the end of his season and really hurt the lead up going into the NFL draft, knowing that he wasn't able to work out. Once again, got an NFL Combine invite, but was only able to participate in interviews and stuff like that. And so, tough situation for him. His brother obviously retired medically because of injuries, and so he was never able to even play collegiately. You hope that this isn't the end of the road for Brant, but as of right now, there's not really a path there unless he picks up a mini camp invite or somebody takes a flyer on him. Things are just not looking good for him, and it's crazy to see considering him coming into this. He was the star tight end, right? He was the guy that everybody was excited about. Dalton Kincaid goes in and he gets obviously his opportunity. Have Caleb Lohner who gets his opportunity. It's just been crazy to kind of see how injuries can derail guys' time. It's hard to know if it's when it's time to leave college and what happens there. So tough opportunity for him. But he'll continue to keep working at that. I have to imagine he continues to talk and tries to find a path. But talking about those undrafted free agent guys, he has a much larger journey to try to get there. Van Fillinger, defensive end, he hasn't gotten a deal, and Money Parks, wide receiver, hasn't gotten a deal. Once again, another guy that was hurt by Utah's offense. There just needed to be more shown for Money to kind of showcase that, but Utah just hadn't been able to do that the last 2 years, and so it really hurt, and it's unfortunate for those guys that they're not able to get there. There's, it's not the full reason, but it's major reasons for that. Beyond that, looking ahead to 2026, Utah already has a guy that's projected to be in the first round. If you've been paying attention, you probably know who this is, and that person is right tackle Spencer Fano. He's a guy that obviously has been able to have a great offseason in terms of the publicity towards who he can be. Had a great a great season last year, and really kind of ramped himself up as one of the top tackles in the league. And, there's a lot of projections saying that he's going to be one of the best in college football. So really fascinated to see what this season means for him. Obviously, there's a lot of upside in what he's able to do. Curious to see how this offense really helps him. But for right now, you have PFF, Pro Football Focus. They list him as the number 10 overall pick next year. Obviously, these aren't, anything until it gets closer. But the fact that you're being talked about this means you're going to go into this fall season with a lot of eyes on you. There's going to be a lot of scouts coming in, and offensive linemen are very valuable in the league, right? If you can get a good offensive lineman, they're going to take you at a high area in the draft, and your career is set in a lot of ways if you can produce. So number 10 by PFF, as I said. CBS Sports lists him as number 16. The Draft Network lists him at 24. Others have him as a first rounder without really tabbing him as a specific spot. Regardless, you've got a guy on your offensive line that is going to get a lot of praise, right? And if he's able to stay healthy and is able to kind of have the season that everybody expects him to have, that's a huge potential for Utah to be able to have a guy that goes in the first round. Anytime you can get a first-round talent drafted, that obviously means a lot of good things. we'll see what other things happen this fall. There's a lot of other talented players around him that could get some, I don't want to say similar looks, but, move up in the draft and do that kind of stuff. So really curious to see what happens there. So it's the nature of the game, right? Like you can go from somebody like a Brant Keithy who had everything at his disposal, or at least it seemed like he did, to falling out of it, right? It's a wicked sport, and you kind of have to jump at the right time. You have to be, you enter it at the hot time. You also have to produce. There's a lot that goes into that, but a lot of optimism right now for Utah, especially moving forward. Spencer Fano's not going to be the only one. Caleb Lohner is getting a lot of praise. Devin Dampier, obviously, if he has a season that Utah hopes that he can have, where he can really showcase his talent, maybe he moves up in there. And, not that he's some highly graded player at this point, but if you've seen with some quarterbacks that after they transfer and they can have a remarkable season, how much that can project them up into the draft, especially a good quarterback, if that works for him. We still don't know, right? We've seen good things from Devin Dampier, but it's really, really tough to project any of that or see how that is. But if, he can follow in some of the paths of guys before him, moving up to a Power 5 level and competing at a high level, taking teams to be competitive for the conference championship or getting into the playoffs, obviously that puts a spotlight on him and gives him the opportunities to be able to produce. That would obviously give more attention to Spencer Fano. That would give more attention to guys like a Caleb Lohner, who's getting that attention. So, really fascinated to kind of see how that goes. So outside of that, last week, we did also have the transfer portal that closed. So this is the spring transfer portal. You've heard me talk about it with the episode with Josh Newman, just kind of the tampering claims and different things that way. But it's a 10-day window in spring. As a reminder, I feel like I have to remind people every time, the window is there just for players to declare. So it's there for them just to say, hey, I want to enter the portal. And, if you've been on Twitter or this is what you like to follow, you'll still see guys that have quote unquote announced today. The reality is they had to let their teams know by Friday at midnight, and it's up to the university to get it in within 48 hours-ish. And so you're starting to get a lot of those announcements out today as the week resumes. But as that goes, Utah was able to stave off a lot of the suitors that were bringing in some top dollars. We talked about BYU being a potential opportunity there with the quote-unquote tampering. Believe it however you want. Every team is tampering. I'll say that. This isn't unusual. That doesn't make it easier for these teams, and it doesn't mean that teams aren't doing it at a different level, right? Some are doing it to a more outward level. Some are doing it more quiet. Some are doing it much more vocally. There's a lot of different things that go into it, but at the end of the day, every team is trying to get new players, right? And whether that is a simple thing is just maintaining a contact that you've had when you recruited a guy, there's some level of that. The reality is, college football is not enforcing tampering, and there's no real way to prove it because nobody wants to out anybody else, as we talked about last time. So regardless of your opinion on tampering, it's the nature of what it is right now. Obviously, as I mentioned in the last podcast, if you listen to it, if not, I think it's a good podcast to listen to with Josh Newman and I discussing all that. The reality is every team is doing it. Every team is facing that struggles, and unless somebody, the league in general, comes down and tries to promote something similar to what the NFL has, where you have an actually bought-in situation where everybody is going to obey and abide by the rules, tampering is meaningless. So really fascinated to kind of see how that develops. But for the time being, Utah was able to do what they needed to be able to stave off a majority of their guys, the guys that they wanted to really maintain. There was a lot of attention around Caleb Lohner. As I mentioned, he's a guy that many believed that they could get him away from Utah, see a ton of upside there. Dallas Vakalahi on the defensive side, there was some attention there. And the biggest name that was thrown out there was Smith Snowden. He plays nickel, can be on the outside. He's a guy that has really showcased his talent last year. And there's a lot of expectations placed on him that he can do even more this year. He's another guy that if he can have a outstanding season, even similar to what he had last year, there's a real potential that he leaves for the league as well. And you have to, I haven't heard this from anyone specifically connected to Snowden, but I do know that there were conversations early on in the fall portal. One of the big reasons that he has stayed at Utah is simply because of their development of defensive backs in the league, right? That's not to say that he can't get that in another school or that he couldn't have that opportunity, but for whatever reason, he's felt like he's in a good spot at Utah. And, because he was the biggest name that was being kind of tossed around there as the quote-unquote tampered player, he sent out a tweet. Guys don't have to do this, but in this current age, it's crazy that you even have to talk about a player like he's not leaving, even though he has never declared his intent to leave. Either way, he put out a tweet on late Friday night, really just kind of understating that he was staying, saying the pride and tradition of the Utah Utes will never be entrusted to the timid or the weak. Go Utes, and just signed it Smith Snowden. That was simply it. Obviously got a lot of reactions from a lot of different people. I don't need to get into that, but it shows that, Utah was able to do whatever they needed to be able to keep these guys, whether that means upping some of their pay, whether that means just being able to kind of establish what they do at Utah as a kind of a selling point. They were able to do it. And so you really didn't have too many scholarship players that left. The biggest name obviously was Zach Williams. That was the surprise that nobody was expecting. He was the guy that was targeted to be wide receiver 1 at Utah and then suddenly decided to enter the portal. Really didn't have any answers other than, he was going to go. He wasn't going to negotiate with things and wanted to go. And it turns out that he transferred transferred as a wide receiver to USC, which is his home. That's where he grew up. It's not unusual for a lot of these guys to do it. If USC wants to throw some cash around to him, all the more power. I'm really curious to kind of see how that works out for him. He's still kind of a projection in a lot of ways. Obviously, he was projected to be wide receiver 1 for Utah, but we don't really know. There was only 10 plays that he was in. Obviously showed a ton of potential. That catch that he made in spring really showcases who he can be. But he's now going to go up with a lot of 4 or 5-star wide receivers at USC. And so does he fall back? Is he going to be a guy that's just kind of in the middle that doesn't really – honestly, he could be kind of like the Dorian Singer, right? Dorian Singer went to USC hoping to get a better opportunity and just simply didn't get a lot of reps. And so, for Zach's sake, you have to hope that he gets what he needs at USC because at Utah he was looking to be, at least near the top, right? Utah was obviously going to address players in the portal and wanting to get that, but they – essentially targeted him as their top guy. Outside of that, you have Sammy Hunter, corner for, that he was here. He's transferred to Fresno State. Kumari Shemwell, another corner, transferred to California. Wyatt Becker is the most interesting situation here. He just quietly removed himself from the team, hasn't really said anything. There hasn't been anything known about him, so he's still kind of out there and what he wants to do. David Washington is a wide receiver that just he entered the portal, but he just wasn't able to get as much traction as he needed to at Utah. Jelani Davis, a safety, that room's been pretty crowded lately. He has no destination now. And then kind of one of the last ones that went into the portal that was a surprise to some and a surprise not to others was Landon King. This is a guy that has obviously had some of the best mindset in terms of kind of how he approaches everything. He's a guy that paid his dues, went in there and didn't always get a lot of the playing time that he thought he should get, but continued to find ways to fight through it and did what he needed to. This spring, he looked like he was going to be able to have a ton of opportunity available to him. I would argue that Hunter Andrews kind of stole some of that. Moving him to tight end really kind of changed things a little bit for Landon King, especially because he's more of the player that Jason Beck is looking for in terms of tight ends. And so they're really just kind of, in my opinion, it just kind of fell out of spot for Landon where, he wasn't able to get the playing time that he wanted, wasn't able to do what he wanted. So I think in some respects, this is probably more of a mutual situation. Utah obviously would have loved to have Landon King still on the roster. I think he provided a ton of upside for Utah and what they were able to do. But this is one of those things where, you have to hope for him that he finds a spot that he can get what he needs. My understanding is he went into the portal with the do not contact tag, which means he probably has a destination already in mind. So I'm really fascinated to kind of see where that goes. He's a good guy. He's a great team guy. I wrote a story about him as picking up the trash after the BYU-Utah game, just kind of really serving as the counterpoint to all the chaos and the nonsense that was going on during that game. Just a great team guy, and really fascinated to see where he goes. So with that, Utah has picked up a few players from the portal. It's been quiet still. This hasn't been a time where Utah has been super active. That's not to say that they haven't been actively working. They've picked up 2 corners from the portal in J.C. Hart. He was from Auburn, and Jalen Mawson from Furman. So 2 corners that are going to be able to provide some depth, potentially give you some length and opportunities there. And then just Sunday, they got the commitment from a wide receiver in Larry Simmons, who made an official visit last week. He comes from Southern Miss. Had a lot of suitors, coming after him, but Utah was able to bring him in and added to their wide receiver depth. They're not done. They, at the very least, they need one more. If they could get more, they would. But wide receiver is a very tough position. There's a lot of these guys that are getting a lot of attention from other schools, as you would expect. But some of the guys that they've been linked to recently are Jermichael Carter, wide receiver from McNeese. I would say that's probably the longest of shots, just simply because of the offers that he's getting and the visits that he's taking. But it's still there. I know he did like his visit to Utah. There's a lot there, but the question is whether Utah is able to still shore up the deal, so to speak. 2 other players that are there is Trey Shackelford, a wide receiver from Washington State, and then they just barely offered a Hawaii wide receiver, Deckel Crowdus. And so curious to see where they go. It's a tough position, right? Utah needs to get more. They obviously are competing with a lot of schools that want to have more wide receivers as well. So we'll see what happens. As of right now, Utah, if you go back to the fall, and if assuming my math is correct, Utah has had 28 scholarship players leave. There's been a lot of walk-on players that have left as well, and some of that is they're either being pushed out because they're not going to meet the 105-man limit that's going to be coming here if this settlement passes. Although there's some nuance to that, simply because the judge, Claudia Wilkins, has said she would like to have a grandfathering in. So we're curious to see how that goes. But some of these coaches have already had conversations with these players about needing to cut down, and they're not going to be a part of that. So it's kind of this limbo situation. Regardless, these were guys that were kind of on the fringe anyway. That's not to say that they couldn't get there. A lot of guys who have been walk-on players have done well and excelled. So curious to see how that goes. But as I said, 28 players that were on scholarship have left Utah since fall. And since then, Utah's added 21. So, they're down a few. They also signed a bunch of players, 20 scholarship players, not counting missionaries. And then 9 of those scholarship players are joining this fall. So or summer, whatever you want to call it. There's still a lot of roster management being there. But if you look at those numbers, that's a ton of people that have come in and out of Utah. So, curious to see how this continues to go. Utah's done a good job of what they need. The priority still is obviously as wide receiver. Defensive line is going to be kind of the secondary position group, as we've talked about. But if they can get anybody that they feel like is going to be an upgrade in talent or projections or whatever that may be, they're going to try to do it. So I would say it's if Utah doesn't get any players, in the next week or two, it's probably about where they're going to sit. That's not to say that they can't get somebody, but the longer this goes on, the less likely it is Utah stays active, right? Players, outside of waiting for a player that's just honestly taking their time, this is kind of where they're at. So it's kind of a wait and see situation. I would expect this week to be pretty active in terms of a lot of players in the portal trying to get teams. But I don't think many teams want to go into May really kind of focusing on that, especially since May starts to turn into, official visit season. They need that kind of rest, so to speak, to kind of prepare for those and to get these guys in and ready to go. So, I would assume this week becomes a pivotal week in that, and then anything outside of this week is probably, it could happen, but it's probably not going to happen. So with that said, 24/7 Sports right now ranks Utah as the 41st best country in the transfer portal. They rank Utah as the 8th best in the Big 12. We'll go through a lot more of this later as we break down these teams, but the top teams in the league have been Texas Tech, the number one. Anybody paying attention to Texas Tech understands what's going on. They've paid top dollar for almost everybody. And so really curious to kind of see how that translates to this season. Houston, number 2, Colorado, number 3, Oklahoma State, 4, West Virginia, 5. And, the bottom 5 is TCU at 11, Arizona at 12, Kansas State at 13. This is 6. I can't count. 14 is Arizona State, 15 Iowa State, and 16 is BYU. Those are the teams that honestly just haven't done a ton in the transfer portal. But if you look at some of those teams are ones that have been at the top of the league the last year. So they maybe felt like they didn't need to. Locally, BYU, obviously, they've lost a few players, but they haven't really signed many. They haven't really signed many the last few classes. They've relied either on who they have, or some of the few transfers that they get in, and then their recruiting class. So curious to see locally how that works. You can make that argument that the best teams didn't need a ton from the portal, and so that's why you're going to see some of those teams down there. Obviously, Arizona State won the league, and they're the 14th highest in there. Iowa State was near the top. BYU was near the top. Kansas State, they were near the top. So you've got a lot of those teams that they felt like they haven't really needed to move forward. Whereas some of the other teams that were more struggling, they're at the top of that portal. So curious to see there. Outside of recruiting in general, Utah is ranked 42nd, so kind of right in line there, 5th in the Big 12. So pretty similar situation there. So we'll get into more of that as the offseason develops. It's kind of hard to do some of this when we don't know who's fully on the roster. But now that the portal's closed and we're starting to get closer to that, we're going to eventually break down kind of the different position groups and kind of go through that. So we'll kind of get some of that stuff as the offseason goes on. We'll break down the defensive positions, the offensive positions. We'll start getting into the recruiting and official visit season, kind of grading out Utah's schedule. And then at the end of the May, so we're only 1 month away, we're going to start breaking down these games, 2 games every week like we did last year. So I think this serves as a great opportunity to kind of see how they are. We'll use that to get into the Big 12 media days, and then we're right into fall camp. So it still seems like a long time. Obviously it is. We're only in April, essentially May. But we're getting close, and soon we're going to have Big 12 media days, and we'll be right back again. So I know it's the tough part of the season, but it is what it is. So let's transition a little bit to men's basketball. They've had some changes as well and gotten some players. But first, I'd really like to, Mason Madsen posted his latest video today, and he really provided some insight that I just don't think we're used to getting publicly. Obviously, Craig Smith was fired from Utah. There was a lot of conversations around the team about how this really hurt Utah. The players were really frustrated in how Utah handled it. Obviously, firing a guy 4 or 5 games left of the season really makes things tough. And so there was some challenges there. But kind of just set the stage. I'd encourage you to go listen to Mason's podcast. I'm not going to play this whole thing. It's not my place, and that's just stealing. So I just took a small little snippet from this to kind of give you an idea of kind of where their mindset was and what happened. But kind of leading into this, Mason talked a lot about how coming into this final season, it wasn't always easy to get to Utah. He knew that he wanted to do that with Gabe if he came back. I wrote about that early on in the season, and you can go read that as well if you'd like. But he said coming into Utah in that summer that he had the most confidence that he'd ever had in himself. He started to feel really good about himself. His shot was coming along. Everything was going well. Early on in non-conference play, he was really kind of showcasing his talent. He started off his first 2 games with 15 points, really kind of looked like Gabe Madsen. And then if both of those 2 players could get going, imagine what that could be. And that's kind of the conversations that were happening right then. And then as it got closer to conference play, his confidence really got shattered. He started losing playing time. He says that there was no real explanation from Coach Smith about why he wasn't getting playing time, and he wasn't one to necessarily ruffle feathers, so he didn't ask, and it just kind of let it sit. But at the end of the day, he wanted to be a team player. And so there were moments where he would get in, and you saw that this season, where he'd get in and suddenly have a breakthrough game, and then other games where he just, he couldn't produce. So there was this roller coaster season for him, especially. Obviously, Gabe went through his own roller coaster season where just he was riding the ups and downs of not having a great shooting performance and then suddenly being able to be the guy that everybody relied on. But, just a lot going on. And so Mason talked about just kind of the frustrations that led. And they go into that UCF game after beating the Kansas teams, and they were openly talking about potentially being an NCAA tournament team. And I know a lot of people laugh at that right now, knowing how the script played out. But going into that, they were 8-8. As he put it, UCF kind of served as a make or break game. It was the must-win game. And they felt like that if they could get that win and then get to about 11 wins that season, they felt like they had at least a legitimate shot to be able to be close to, being on the bubble, right? It was probably a little bit more difficult than that, but it was much closer than I think Utah fans would like to admit. Utah was close. They were doing things in the Big 12 that was, making some rumblings. It wasn't perfect, right? Like, we understand that. It wasn't a perfect season, and they definitely didn't live up to their expectations that they had for themselves or what others had for them. But that kind of sets the stage to that UCF game where they end up losing a game that they should have won, and as a result of that, Utah fires Craig Smith. So I'll pick it up here where the Madsens, the next day after that UCF loss, obviously down, really feeling like they lost their chances at getting to the NCAA tournament, but really had a good conference record, so to speak. They had an off day the next day, and they were out golfing when they got a call from somebody in the athletic department saying they had an emergency meeting that they needed to get back to. So with that context, here's Mason.
I honestly I'm not here to burn bridges, but I think this needs to be talked about. Out of everyone that was on our team, I can say I didn't agree with everything that was going on. For me individually, if I'm just from a selfish point of view, not agreeing with everything that's going on. Do I think I should be playing? Hell yeah, I think I should be playing. Do I think I impact winning? Hell yeah, that's been well documented. But on a human level, the way they did Coach Smith was so wrong. It was so unexpected, and we were all completely blindsided. There was never a hint that this was happening. I know it's a business at the end of the day, and it's a results business at that, and so you need to perform. I just don't see a world where, with the resources that we had, and that doesn't mean we didn't have a team good enough, because we had lots of guys who were maybe underpaid, and more years in college will show that, because they're going to go make way more money than they made this year. May have been underpaid, but we had the right guys in the locker room to make the tournament. I don't think 8 and 9 in Big 12 play is a fireable offense. So to have that happen at that point in the season with 3 games of the regular season, 4 games total left was really, really weird. And the timing was just it couldn't have been worse, honestly. So we all got brought in. I remember we walk in, everyone's already in the film room. Our AD has already delivered the news. If I didn't see on Twitter, I wouldn't have known what was going on. I saw that and so it was just kind of messed up. Like, I don't honestly care that they didn't wait for me. I've been here for less than a year. But for them to not wait for Gabe to be in that meeting while they fired Coach Smith and broke that news, I think was really disrespectful. That's something that forever will not sit right with me.
Really fascinating statements to unpack there. This team was hurt by how they fired Craig, and firing a coach obviously is going to be emotional anyway, just because a lot of these guys, they commit to a coach, and many will stay at a university after a coach leaves, but it's a tough situation to be able to go into that and know that you still somewhat have something left to play for, and you fire a guy that you believed in, right? And like you said, it's a business, right? And it's tough because you've got to be able to manage a lot of those expectations. But there was a lot of frustrations there where he said, based on the amount of resources they had, which we've talked about, they haven't been a ton, despite, some of the protestations from athletic officials saying that they have given them everything that they needed to. They didn't. They didn't have the NIL that other people had. They didn't have the institutional support that other programs had. And so this meeting hurt them a ton. Obviously, to be able to do that where you don't even wait for Gabe Madsen, that obviously hurts a ton. And so I think there's a lot there where you're seeing why a lot of the players that were on the roster that were maybe fringe guys that could have potentially come back, not fringe, I mean guys that went into the portal but were still considering Utah, one of the reasons why they didn't want to come back is because of that meeting. They were hurt so much by the athletic department's way that they handled that. And this is not the first person that I've heard this from. It was just more now finally somebody inside the meeting that's openly talking about it that says it, that really frustrated a lot of these players. Obviously, they tried their best to finish out that season, but you can see based on what happened why it was such an emotional situation. And I understand it. Mark Harlan had to do what he had to do at the time that he wanted to do it, right? He has to feel like, if I'm going to go and blow this thing up, this is how it has to be done, right? And so at the end of the day, it's a business. Businesses do it all the time. They lay off workforces to be able to pivot or do whatever. Like, nobody's immune to that. We get that. But I think the frustration there from this team specifically, and the conversations that I've had as well, is that this absolutely hurt the team. And it really kind of changed their perception of how Utah does things based on that, based on what they were given, and changed, to try to make things better, right? Yes, you hire in a great coach, an Alex Jensen that comes in and everybody's excited for that. You've got a lot of optimism going into the next season, and I'll get into that in just a second. But I think that's largely what happened in terms of how this team kind of collapsed at the end. And I'm glad Mason kind of said that. It's not always easy for me to say that. The problem in the media sometimes is we can try to say things and we have to use it in sourcing, and sometimes that's anonymous sourcing that people hear. But the reality is there's not always times where people believe us because we're just getting this information from somebody else, right? And you also have to be careful and guarded about how you use some of that information, because you don't want to either burn people, you don't want to, say things that are going to hurt other things, especially if it's not going to be beneficial to anybody, right? And so there's a lot of these things that just kind of go behind the scenes that, us as reporters can hear, but we can't fully kind of put out there unless we have like some legitimacy to it, right? I'm not going to feel comfortable going with something unless I have like a real understanding of it, or I have multiple people saying it that I could feel like I'm confident doing it. Somebody has to go on the record to some extent, right? And so that becomes the challenge with a lot of these things. The fact that Mason could go out there and kind of say the same things that I'd heard really kind of showcases the situation, that this was something that they were really frustrated with. Like he said, he doesn't want to burn bridges. And if you watch the video, please go watch the video to hear more of it. Outside of some of the cheesy music that's there, it's a good perspective on kind of where he was at, if that's what you're interested in. But, he's in his background, he's got all the running Utes next to him. It's not that he hated his time at the running Utes. If anything, he felt like this season, until he started losing playing time and had no real reason to understand that, this was the year where he felt the most confident in himself as a basketball player. He didn't feel the imposter syndrome that he says, that kind of stuff. And so this is not him trying to burn bridges with Utah by any means. He loved his time at Utah. If anything, he was more hurt by what happened with Gabe, with all that went in there, and then just everything that went into that. So really, really interesting podcast. I'd encourage you to go listen to it just to be able to get more context if you're interested. He didn't set me up to say that. That's not me trying to promote his broadcast. I just saw it and felt like it provides more context that only he can provide, right? I can have all these conversations with people on the side, but he was in the locker room. He was the guy that gets the information and says it. So really fascinating to hear kind of his perspective on how everything went. So outside of that, looking forward to, moving forward with this team. Last Saturday, or on Saturday, they did Utah added another forward in Seydou Traore, former Iowa forward. He averaged 5.9 points on 43% shooting, 44% if you round. 3 rebounds and 1.4 assists, and he started in the final 12 games of the season for Iowa. Another upside player, that has a few years playing, that really gives Utah a lot of opportunities. Right now, Utah is sitting at 9 scholarship players out of the 15 possible. Technically, it's really 13, but if this NCAA settlement goes through, it jumps up to 15. So I don't know what we'll get with that, how Alex Jensen will kind of round that out. If he wants to be able to go to the full 15. Some coaches don't want to do that. Some coaches want to, kind of fill it out to the max to be able to make sure that they can get more depth, that kind of stuff. But we'll see what happens. As of right now, though, your average height is pretty close to on par with what Utah had last year, just a little bit shorter. Last year's average was about 6'6.5". This year, so far, it's about 6'6.3". So pretty close to the same. Alex Jensen has tried to find a lot of guys that are going to have a lot of, they're going to get up and down the floor really quickly. They're going to have some length. They're going to be able to do some things that are disruptive, and really, really kind of change the tone of how Utah's played the last little bit. So right now, if I were to project kind of a potential starting unit, and this is, completely flawed, but right now it looks like Utah, Utah would run with Terrence Brown, former point guard from Fairleigh Dickinson. Right now he's kind of the only point guard on the team, though, so Utah's going to need some depth there. They do have other guards that are more shooting guard that you can rely on, but they're going to need some more guard play there, depending on what goes on. So I would expect him to probably get a starting opportunity. Maybe you get Elijah Moore in there as your 2 guard. He's a shooting guard from Syracuse. Has some potential there. And then you've got a whole roster full of forwards, right? And some of them are kind of like the forward/center. They're more of your 4, power forward. Power forward's kind of a dying term in my opinion, and kind of this evolution of basketball. But you've got some of those guys. So I would say Ja'Kai Howard, he's the Auburn small forward. He's going to get your 3 spot. And then it's kind of a determination on how you want to use those other 2 positions. Do you want to go more small ball? Utah has nobody over 6'9" right now. There's no 7-footers, no true center. That's how it goes. That doesn't mean that Utah can't be effective without that. You would just go quote unquote small ball. Not that 6'9" is small by any means, but that's kind of how you would look. If you did it this way, you could obviously put Keanu Dawes in there as your guy that's going to start, and then potentially, Ibi Traore, that can get in there. He's intriguing. Craig Smith had talked about him being a guy that was really going to showcase a lot of talent, and being able to be there. But he's young, and he's coming off of an injury. So curious to see if he would be the guy. But for the most part, there's a lot of different things that Utah can do to change, and we'll see what happens. So that's kind of it today. We'll go into more of this kind of stuff as it goes on, but it seems like the men's basketball team is kind of finally starting to round out. They at least have enough players to play a season. Those are probably the bulk of your guys that are going to get the time. But really curious to kind of see how this develops and moves forward. So it's summer conditioning will be coming faster than you can expect, and so this roster is going to need to be filled out soon. But with that, we'll sign off for this week. We'll get some more stuff in later, and if anything breaks, we'll start something. But outside of that, we'll see you again next week. So thanks for listening. Have a great week.